As a fitness professional, it is easy to keep my focus on the great things that occur from exercise and staying active. Now, we know so much about the benefits of exercise, and I get excited about helping my clients discover, how their bodies can improve. Something that is not quite as uplifting is what occurs if someone isn't or can't be active. Now, you know the old adage, if you don't use it, you lose it. When we state this, we never really discuss what exactly it is. Well, today, it is muscle. And we're talking about muscle atrophy on the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast.
Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast
with Garrett Williamson.
Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
Muscle atrophy. Now, you know by now that I really love to start with definitions. So that's the easiest place to start when talking about muscle atrophy. Now, it may be something you've heard about, but let's dive head first into it today and see what it exactly is, because there's a reason why this stuff happens, and we're going to explain all that today. What is muscle atrophy? Well, muscle atrophy is a wasting. It can be a thinning or loss of muscle tissue. Now, thinning is in the definition. It's actually in parentheses, but it doesn't really thin. It doesn't really become, stretch so much that it becomes thin. It just is a wasting away. There's just a loss of muscle tissue. It's a term used to describe the loss of muscle, and atrophy may occur from many things. It can occur from injuries, a broken arm, like a broken arm wasting away in a cast. You've probably had that happen before. If you've ever broken a limb and you've had it in a brace or a cast, you've noticed that limb is smaller, thinner when the cast comes off, and that's a wasting away. That's actually muscle atrophy has happened. It can happen from starvation. When you see somebody that is women starving themselves, anorexic, or somebody in a difficult situation, when you see pictures of POWs being released in Vietnam, World War II, you notice they were very thin. Well, it's not just fat that they lost. Their body knows to feed off of that muscle because it has a lot of energy in it. And of course, they've lost quite a bit of muscle. So disease, bed rest, nerve damage, and several other health-related issues can cause muscle atrophy. And there's a myriad of other reasons why we become less active and or take in the correct amount of calories and nutrients to maintain muscle. Now, the reason I put this last part in, a myriad of other reasons why we become either less active and or take in the incorrect amount of calories and nutrients to maintain muscle. The reason I put that in there is the fact that that's what it boils down to. Now, a disease can cause it, an injury can cause it, but what it's causing is it's causing a retardation of the nutrients, or there's plenty of nutrients there to build muscle. We're just not breaking down muscle tissue so that it builds, or we're not exercising or moving that muscle. Therefore, the body looks at it and says, you know what? We don't need it anymore. Because as I've said many times before, that your body is the most intelligent machine that you'll ever encounter. And it does constant systems check all the time, trying to figure out what is being used, what's not being used. And that's how it makes a decision on whether or not to break a muscle down or actually start muscle atrophy. Now, there are actually 3 types of muscle atrophy. I don't want to bore you with this too long, but understanding the 3 types fully explains why we lose muscle and why it is not because of the lie we have been told. I think y'all know the lie that I'm talking about. If you heard my podcast, if you listened to the series, it is not because of time passing on a calendar. I'm going to show you why that's not true. First is there's physiologic atrophy, which is caused by not using the muscle enough. That's pretty simple. You don't use it, you'll lose it. This type of atrophy can often be reversed. Not often, as far as I'm concerned, it can always be reversed. I've yet to see a time when it can't be reversed. And if it can't be reversed, it's because of some prohibiting factor, an injury, a disease, some inability. But it can be reversed with exercise and better nutrition. People who are most affected by this are those who have seated jobs, health problems that limit their movement, or just any kind of decreased activity levels. So we had a pandemic sweep through here, and there's quite a bit of atrophy going on, or that has gone on during that time. And it's strictly because people just aren't moving as much. They're less active. And hold on to that thought, because that helps describe why we make the completely incorrect assumption that atrophy has anything to do with time passing on a calendar. Becoming less active. Think about that. But people that are bedridden, people that cannot move their limbs because of a stroke or a brain disease, anytime that we cannot make our bodies do a lot of resistance to gravity, we also have that same problem. And the reason I bring up gravity, we have gravity on Earth, and when you're doing resistance training, you are fighting gravity. Gravity is helping us grow. And the reason I bring that up is, of course, is during space flights. According to, you have quite a bit of atrophy going on because they don't have the gravitational pull of the Earth. Therefore, they're not causing a resistance type situation on a regular basis. They're not walking around, and therefore the Earth's gravity that's usually pulling on them, that's causing their quadriceps and their glutes and their calf muscles to fire, for their lower back and their core muscles to hold the body upright. They don't have that. So they end up atrophying muscle. In fact, according to NASA, astronauts experience up to a 20% loss of muscle mass on space flights lasting 5 to 11 days. That's a lot. I mean, 20% of their muscle mass they lose in 11 days. Now, this is why, if you've seen The Right Stuff, you saw all the training and exercising, all the large amounts of training that they did, but there was quite a bit of physical fitness involved in being an astronaut. There still is. You have to meet certain physical standards to be an astronaut. And if you saw the movie, and another fan favorite is Space Cowboys, where Clint Eastwood and his gang that got passed over for a mission in the 60s, brought back in the, I guess, 90s or early 2000s to retrieve a Russian satellite, and they were going to go up in space. So they had them working out, had them exercising. And this is why, because you can actually lose all that muscle mass. That's going to affect everything in your body. And it's strictly because the gravity is not doing its job. You're not having that constant resistance. So that's physiological atrophy. Now you can have pathologic atrophy. And this is seen with starvation and diseases such as like Cushing's disease because of taking many medicines like corticosteroids. They can actually cause this atrophy. This is typically associated with aging or time passing on the calendar. That is in no way responsible for muscle loss. The pathologic atrophy usually becomes because of a disease, causing a starvation. Go back to what I said earlier. It is the lack of the right types and the right amount of nutrients going in, and inactivity. That's what causes atrophy. And then there's neurogenic atrophy. And it's the most severe type of muscle atrophy. Now, this drives home what I'm saying about what causes all atrophy. This could be from an injury to or a disease of a nerve that connects to the muscle. Basically, in that situation, you've got a muscle there, and it's perfectly healthy. It can grow, it can get stronger, it can atrophy, it's full of life. But the communication center, the nerve, is damaged. Or the nerve communication somehow is damaged. Maybe not the nerve that's directly attached to that tendon, that ligament that's firing that part of your body, but somewhere there's a break in the communication. So basically, you can try to do or think about doing a bicep curl all you want, but if the message does not get to the bicep to fire, then the muscle will not work, cannot work, therefore causing inactivity, therefore causing atrophy. Now, you've got several different examples of diseases affecting nerves that control muscles. You've got amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I'm sure all of you know what that is. And the reason you know what it is it's usually listed as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. You can have damage to a single nerve, like in a carpal tunnel syndrome. They've got Guillain-Barré syndrome. You've got Barr syndrome. You've got nerves damage caused by injuries, diabetes, toxins, alcohol. Polio is something like this, spinal cord injury. And this is one that's near and dear to my heart because I have worked with clients with what's called Trendelenburg gait. And this is a situation that causes, when you're walking, your hip actually kicks out to the side because the hip adductor mechanism will not fire. And that is what actually holds your leg in a certain position so that when you walk, the hip does not drop down. Well, if that muscle doesn't fire, that's when you find out how much that muscle does, because it causes this funny kind of hip kick out to the side gait when somebody walks. And the individual that I've worked with that's had that, this was an interesting situation because it seemed like when the communication was getting to the muscle, it was only been interrupted when we had multiple muscle movements. But when we would fire that muscle by itself, it works just fine. So it's kind of interesting. But anyway, back to that. Neurogenic atrophy is when you don't have, and that's why neuro is in there, you don't have communication to the muscle, therefore causing inactivity. This is not a nutrition situation. Causing inactivity, therefore causing atrophy. And if you look at each one of these, you'll see that the bottom line is lack of nutrients, lack of activity. And I can go on for days about this, but these are mainly things that retard growth of the muscle or cause inactivity, and that's burns. Long-term corticosteroid therapy, which actually breaks down that area. Malnutrition, I was saying that a minute ago. muscular dystrophy, osteoarthritis, and rheumatoid arthritis. Now, osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis, the main reason they're saying that is a cause of atrophy, it's not that the arthritis itself causes the muscle to deteriorate. And I want to be clear about all this. What's happening there is there's pain associated with movement in that area, or there is a joint frozen because of arthritis, a joint that can't move, no matter how much the muscle fires. Therefore, if that joint can't move, whoever has that condition, they have no reason to fire that muscle. They basically can't fire it because they cannot move the joint. Again, no matter that it is osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis causing the difficulty, it's not actually directly causing the muscle to atrophy. It happens to be the catalyst, but it's not what's causing the muscle to atrophy. And the reason I'm beating this to death is the fact that too many times in my field do I hear, especially with weight gain and weight loss, well, lack of sleep causes weight gain. Well, lack of sleep really doesn't cause weight to get on you. Lack of sleep causes energy loss, therefore it causes you to be less active. That's why I'm getting so descriptive about the fact that osteoarthritis does not directly cause a muscle to atrophy. When you boil all these things down that I typically talk about, they usually break down to one simple cause and effect. And if we would address those cause and effects, we would be far better than falling into, well, you've got osteoarthritis, therefore you're going to have atrophy. Just accept it as it is, when it's not really true. And the reason I'm beating that so much to death right now is something we're going to talk about a little later here, and that is where we've gotten so conditioned to believe that time passing on a calendar causes us to deteriorate. We've gotten so conditioned with atrophy, they've actually named this condition. And by putting a name on it, they've certified it. Therefore, it must be true. And it just simply isn't. I'll get to that in just a minute. So, now to understand how our bodies could be affected by experiencing muscle atrophy, we need to think about how we rely on our muscles. The muscular system provides strength, endurance in movement, stabilization, and protection. But muscles are able to contract and relax, moving or stabilizing the joints. This is their job. They're to move and stabilize the joints. They're to contract the joints and move, like I'm sitting here looking at my hands and I'm pulling my fingers in and release them. That's a muscle that's connected to that bone that's making that happen. It's also, that muscle is also there to basically protect the bone. And what do I mean by that? Well, it is like body armor. Well, yeah, it is. A muscle is somewhat like body armor. In fact, if you have a hip and you have good medial glutes, that muscle that's kind of on the outside of the hip, that when you're doing the outer thigh machine or you're doing simple side leg raises, you feel that hip, that muscle burn. Well, that is actually a thick coating on top of the hip. And if you were to fall on that pelvic bone and you have a pretty good thick cushion there, you literally are protecting the bone that way. The other way that it protects it is, we see this a lot in joints and especially knees. People think that, well, I got to a certain age and my knees, they just wore out. Well, something actually caused them to wear out. And when the muscle weakens, when it atrophies, it's there as a shock absorber. It's there to any pressure that comes towards that joint. The muscle is there to take that pressure, much like a shock absorber. And if it can't take the pressure, like standing up, when you go to stand up, you fire your quadriceps, you fire your glutes. If you have difficulty standing up, you're standing up really slow and you have a really tough time with it, well, then that muscle is getting overstressed and now it can't protect the joint. Now the pressure that you're trying to carry with the muscle now goes into the joint, and the joint's not made to handle that. Over time, doing that consistently, not just because of time, but over time doing that consistently is going to wear out a joint. This concept that, of course, a joint wears out over time, it's not because of time, it's because of the misuse and activity. If you've got that in motion, the beginnings of atrophy, then eventually you're going to compromise the function of that joint. I'm going to stay on that knee for a second, and I'm probably beating this to death. I've just seen a lot of this lately. In fact, I saw it this morning with the client that had a knee replacement and trying to explain to me that, well, I'll have difficulty doing this particular exercise because I've had a knee replacement. Well, it's not completely true. The reason I say that is if you have a joint replacement and the doctor tells you, well, you had a fantastic surgery, everything went well, usually they'll tell you this typically before, once you get that joint replaced, it's going to be good as new. Now, you can have bone deteriorating around it because of osteoporosis or so many years of atrophied muscle that the joint has taken so much damage around it that you might have a problem. But typically, when you replace that joint, it is good as new. The reason that people ask the question, well, when is it going to wear out again, is because if you go back to living the exact same lifestyle that ruined your first joint, I promise you, you're going to break down and ruin that second one. So again, inactivity, lack of nutrition, causing atrophy, causing this joint trouble, not associated with age. I probably need to get off my soapbox about my age thing. That's really hard for me to do because I live, thrive, and survive by that. Now, in atrophy, I get this question quite a lot. Do you lose size or do you lose strength? Well, when muscle atrophy occurs, we need to know what is actually happening in the body when size and strength are gained. And here's what I mean by that, dude. That's a misconception about strength training is that, I especially had this with ladies early on in my career, that if I lift a weight, I'm going to get huge. I'm going to get really, really, really big. And if I do ballet type movements, I'll produce a thinner muscle. And that's not really true. When hypertrophy is actually the growth of skeletal muscle fibers in response to overcoming force from high volumes. In other words, overloading the muscle. You have hypertrophy. And when you have high volumes of tension, you're going to cause that. And this is the regeneration of muscle cells after progressive resistance training programs, or any kind of resistance training, standing up and sitting down, doesn't matter. And hypertrophy can also be described as an increase in the cross-sectional area of the muscles, basically where the muscle fibers actually rub over each other and actually pull together. It's when you have a contraction. Although you have this hypertrophy, when you are working out and exercising and causing these muscles to grow, the muscles can get stronger, a lot stronger without seeing a huge amount of muscle size. This is typically what most of my clients are after. They want to get strength, but they're not interested in, quote unquote, I get this all the time, bulking up. And that's not typically the case. The too many people that I think I've told you all this on a podcast before about a client whose daughter-in-law wanted to keep asking her mother-in-law questions for me to answer because she had this strange condition that she got really big every time she lifted weights. Every time she lifted weights, she got so big because she has these big muscles. They were just abnormally large. The only thing is, it was kind of funny about that, and I've told this story before, she had liposuction a few years later, and I asked my client when she told me she had liposuction, I asked, wow, how much of that monstrous muscle did they have to take out of there? Well, of course, they finally got it. We weren't talking about muscle. We were talking about fat. But even though you have this hypertrophy, you're typically gaining strength, but you're not gaining a lot of size. So, yes, you can lose some size when you have atrophy. You're going to lose muscle. You're going to lose muscle fiber. So you're going to see some size changes there. But more importantly, you're losing strength because let's say, probably the easiest way to explain this, I'm just picking an arbitrary number here. Your muscle's 5 inches big versus somebody that has that same muscle and it's, 20 inches big. Well, if you lose 1 inch of that muscle, a half inch of that muscle, whatever, that's going to be a heck of a lot proportionally than somebody that has a larger amount of muscle in that area loses the same amount. So atrophy on a weaker muscle or on a quote unquote smaller muscle for that matter can be far more severe than somebody that works out on a regular basis and they take a couple of weeks off. They're going to go backwards, but they're not going to go backwards anywhere near to the level of somebody that is weaker. Now, I think that's kind of makes sense to the common man for that matter, but this is where I have difficulty with some of my early adapters of exercise. They're early to adapt to exercise. Now, they may be in their 70s or 80s, but they're early on to exercise. So they feel like they've worked out really hard, they've got all this muscle, but actually they're really far behind. So to them, taking a week or two off can be severely damaging because of atrophy. I don't want to spend much time on this, but I am going to answer this question because you get this a lot. Does muscle turn to fat if you don't work out? No. If steel gets weak, it doesn't turn into wood. Muscle does not change its molecular properties and end up as fat. That does not happen. What is happening there, a lot of times people observe that in their own body. Well, I used to have all this muscle. Now it's all turned to flab. Hasn't turned to flab. What has happened typically in those cases is somebody's gotten very inactive, but they've maintained their input of calories. Therefore, the body that couldn't make muscle out of it wasn't burning it off, first thing burning excess calories off through the exercise they were doing. But more importantly, it had no reason to build muscle because the person's inactive. Well, the body's going to store that energy. It's going to store it as fat. And that's why a lot of people think that muscle turns to fat. Muscle does not turn to fat in any way, shape, or form. Well, how quickly does atrophy set in? Well, typically, the ACSM, National Strength and Conditioning Association, they actually say that true atrophy happens 3 weeks after a workout. That's where you've really lost your muscle. Well, actually, that's not true. You begin to atrophy. You begin the process within 72 hours after a workout. Now, it sounds, wow, that's a huge discrepancy, 72 hours in 3 weeks. No, what's happening is your body is doing that systems check. Now, what I mean by that is, let's say you go and do a bicep workout and you go and do some curls and you're basically doing 3 sets of 15 at 20-pound repetitions, 20-pound dumbbells, whatever, doesn't matter. And you've torn some muscle tissue, you've gotten sore. And therefore, the body says, you know what? Evidently, that muscle wasn't strong enough because we tore some tissues while he was working out. So let's build it back. And since we have the nutrients here, we have enough protein on board. We've got enough calories to take care of our energy needs. Let's build that muscle back. It builds it back. And this time, we're not going to build it back to handle 20-pound dumbbells. We're going to build it back to handle something maybe a little heavier because we couldn't handle that. So it's going to build it back stronger. That's how we grow. That's exactly what we're doing in a resistance training program. Well, what's going to happen is within 72 hours, let's say the atrophy security, atrophy analyst are basically going to go around the body and check, okay, we're using that shoulder, are we using that calf? Hey, the other day we're using that bicep. Now, you did some 20-pound dumbbells the other day and couldn't handle it, so we built that back stronger, but are you using it? Are you still using it? Are you needing that strength? Because we could actually take that stuff that we built for you and we could burn it for energy, or we could use that energy over here because we did some stuff on these shoulders today and we need to build some strength over there and we need some energy to make that happen. And 2 ways of storing energy. You've got stored energy in your body fat. You've actually got stored energy in muscle. In fact, you've got stored energy in bone if you want to get down to it. But any kind of tissue on your body can be turned around and used for energy. So your body's going to check, hey, we're using that bicep. Is it still relevant? Or do we need to break it down and burn it? And that's why I say that atrophy literally can begin within 72 hours after a workout. Now, how often do we need to actually do resistance training in order to avoid atrophy or to maintain muscle? Well, but the true concept of this is the bare minimum is difficult. It's challenging to actually pinpoint because of how complex our bodies truly are. Also, how complex our lifestyles are. Ideally, if we're nourishing our bodies properly with the right quality and quantity, especially, of what is needed, of what we need. And we're handling stress well, keeping in proper, what we call homeostasis. In other words, getting plenty of rest and what have you. And all other systems are running okay. You don't have a disease you're not telling me about. Then the average person can maintain their body's strength and size with just really 2 to 3 resistance training workouts a week. And that's maintaining. That's not growing and developing, but that's maintaining. And of course, you want to include cardio and what have you to help the cardiovascular system, which helps muscle grow. Now, as far as growing, it's a little different story. Of course, the more you make changes, the more you actually overstress the muscle using the overload principle. And overload principle, not just in your daily workout, but actually in your whole strategy in your workout program. The more aggressive you are about that, of course, the more gains you're going to have, unless you get too aggressive and you never actually allow the muscle to repair. But to give you kind of a rule of thumb, typically every program needs to increase its intensity between 4 to 8 weeks. If we're looking for really making gains, strength gains and what have you, that's a good quote unquote rule of thumb as far as changing it up so that you're not going backwards, you're not causing atrophy. Typically, your larger muscles show signs of atrophy quicker. Yeah, that's typically your leg muscles, glute, quadriceps. They show atrophy even quicker. Why? Because they have a heck of a lot more mass there. The body knows that. It can go and pull energy from those muscles and break down those muscle tissue without affecting the function of that muscle and the protection of that joint as much as it can, say, go and pull muscle out of one of your fingers. And so your larger muscles do show signs of atrophy far quicker. Last thing I want to bring up on this is the concept I talked about at the very beginning about age being associated with atrophy, which is not true in any way, shape, or form. There's a term that they've thrown out, and I've talked about this in the podcast I did on muscle, and they throw this term out called sarcopenia. And I'm going to put on air right now and recorded for everyone to hear that sarcopenia is a lie. I mean, if you break down the causes of sarcopenia, and which is the seemingly loss of muscle. I say seemingly, it doesn't have that in the definition. It says the loss of muscle as you age is basically what sarcopenia is supposed to be. I say seemingly loss of muscle because if it were true that we lose muscle as we age, then somebody would be able to tell you at what age you're actually everybody is going to lose the muscle. You can't have, everybody at 57 does this except for these 4,000 men that have proved it wrong because they've stayed active. And if you look at the definition of sarcopenia, you go and start doing some research on sarcopenia, you'll find out that sarcopenia is tied to lack of nutrition and inactivity, period. Oh, they try to throw testosterone in there and a few other things, but it boils down to lack of nutrition and lack of activity, no matter the age. So once again, muscle atrophy, we can avoid it. It's easy. It's very easy. I said it in the first sentence of this podcast. Use it or lose it. Keep busy. Keep the right caloric intake in. Make sure you stay active. Stay hydrated. And in order to avoid atrophy, just live your level of wellness.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 251-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.